You all voted resoundingly on another Harry Potter Iceberg video, so here I am delivering. While the last video covered a lot of areas of lore that might have been more common knowledge to some of you, I think this one is really going to jump off the deep end. Even though I'm not a super fan, I'd consider myself pretty knowledgeable, and I don't think that I had heard of most of these theories before. So let's go down another Harry Potter iceberg, focusing on some of the most intriguing theories that I could find. Before we start, take a moment to click that subscribe button and say hi in the comments. It helps push this video out further to more people so that I can keep making more content for you. Subscribing helps me grow the channel, and I promise you won't be disappointed. Plus, it'll bring you more videos from the vault right to your homepage. With that, this is the Harry Potter fan theory iceberg explained. As always, we're going to start this off with level 1. Dumbledore's chocolate frogs. Let's kick this iceberg off with a banger. Do you remember early on in the Philosopher's Stone when Harry first gets on the train to Hogwarts? This is where we, as the audience, and Harry as a new wizard, are first introduced to the candy of the wizarding world, and with it, the chocolate frogs and their portrait cards. With his first ever pull of a famous witch or wizard, Harry pulls a Dumbledore card. Sure, it of course makes sense with the story that J.K. Rowling is telling, but what if there's more to it, and Dumbledore purposely planted the card so Harry would pull it? Maybe Dumbledore had Harry pull his card as a way to keep an eye on him through his magical portrait. I'm gonna lose some of you here, I know, but I also know that from the lore perspective, portraits are not alive. They're merely imitations of the subject. But we also know that the portraits are able to move from frame to frame, making it possible for them to share knowledge. Finally, we know that the power of the portrait is not so much down to the painter, who paints the painting, but instead based on the power of the witch or wizard in said painting. This means that for a wizard of Dumbledore's power, arguably the most powerful wizard in existence, the power of his portrait must also be substantial, even if it's just on a chocolate frog card. When Harry pulls the Dumbledore card, if I remember correctly, Ron says to him that he has loads of him, suggesting that even though Dumbledore is the most powerful wizard, his chocolate frog card is not a rare one. What could be the purpose of flooding the market with thousands, maybe millions, of your own portrait? That's right, Dumbledore is using his self-portrait as a network of spies, probably able to gather information from just about every household in the wizarding world. So, what does Dumbledore have to say for himself on the topic? Well, according to Bill Weasley, quote, Dumbledore says he doesn't care what they do as long as they don't take him off the chocolate frog cards, end quote. This comes up when discussing the topic of the Ministry of Magic removing his Order of Merlin status, which is essentially like a knighthood, but for wizards. So, Dumbledore is okay with losing in honor of the highest order in the wizarding world, so long as they don't take him off the card of some chocolate frogs? It seems a little bit fishy to say the least, but I guess if you had to choose between a secret spy network that could inform you about just about everything in the wizarding world and a fancy medal, I'd probably pick the cards as well. The only question that leaves me with is there a limit? Where is all the learned information stored? I have to assume it doesn't go directly into the real Dumbledore's brain, so maybe his portraits self-organize and make sure that only the most important information bubbles up to the top? Either way, this would explain how he's always able to stay one step ahead. Who knows, maybe even Voldemort enjoyed a chocolate frog once in a while, and maybe there was a Dumbledore card tucked away in his back pocket. Ron's Deluminator. In my opinion, this was one of the more confusing and unexplained topics in the later books. In fact, I'm not really sure if it was ever truly explained. It might have been explored a little bit more in the movies after the main series, with the Magical Beast movies and all those, but I don't think the books were ever super clear on it. Dumbledore's Deluminator is a tricky little piece of magic. We're introduced to the device almost immediately in the series, along with its primary function, removing the lights and darkening a specific area. In case you still don't know what it is, it's the thing that Dumbledore pulls out at the beginning of the first movie and sucks in the lights that are in Privet Drive where he drops off Harry. It also makes that cool swoop sound in the movies. Anyway, that isn't all the Deluminator can do. In fact, to call it its primary function might actually be a bit misleading, and maybe that's on purpose. It's glossed over quickly in the movies, but Dumbledore has included an enchantment of sorts on the Deluminator, making the user able to hear a short snippet of a conversation after their name is mentioned. What isn't exactly clear is, does that work for whoever the user of the Deluminator is, or does it only work for certain people? To say that a little differently, can only Dumbledore hear snippets about himself, and then only Ron after it's gifted to him, or would the magic apply to whoever is using the device? One suggestion I found is that the science, or rather the magical method behind the Deluminator's spying capabilities, is the use of a taboo. Now, in the wizarding world, a taboo is not what we would think of in the Muggle world. Instead, it's a powerful jinx set up around a certain key phrase that reveals the speaker's location. In fact, if you didn't know, this is the basis for Voldemort being referred to as he who must not be named. Voldemort made his own name a taboo, which allowed Death Eaters to track down Aurors and members of the Order of Phoenix. Presumably, they were the only ones brave enough to say his name, besides, of course, other Death Eaters. So back to the Deluminator. Dumbledore set up his own name as a taboo in conjunction with the Deluminator, which also helped him apparate to wherever he was being spoken about. And then he also set up Ron's name, knowing in advance that Ron would need help finding his way back to Harry and Hermione. I guess the distinction being made here is that Dumbledore had a plan for Ron to be the one that would need to find his way back. Perhaps Dumbledore saw a bit of himself in Ron, as a hothead that would regret storming out on his friends, and he offered him a way to return. There are many more connections between Dumbledore and Ron, and we'll get to that in a later theory down the iceberg. Ron the Seer.
Not me, not Hermione, you!
Let's stay on the topic of Ron for a little bit longer. He always is seen as the comic relief in the series, the jokester, the one in the gang that nobody really takes seriously. But this theory supposes that behind that ignorance lies the makings of a great seer, a wizard able to divine the future and read the fortunes of others offhandedly and effortlessly. What's interesting about these theories is that they've existed for such a long time and still retain traction today. The earliest example I found of this one was posted on a fan fiction site in 2012, though they mention reading it on some other source, so I'm sure it dates back even further. It picks up right away in Book 1 with Ron's nascent warnings about the Mirror of Erised. He warns Harry to stay away from it, saying that he has a funny feeling about it. And he's correct on two levels. First, Dumbledore then confronts Harry and tells him that men have been driven mad staring into the mirror for too long, confirming that there is something a little bit sinister about the mirror. And then, of course, there's the finale of the book where Harry battles Quirrell and Voldemort right in front of that mirror. In the Chamber of Secrets, Ron makes an offhanded comment about Tom Riddle being the one who murdered Moaning Myrtle, and it turns out that he was actually correct about this. He also hilariously guesses that Lockhart is a phony. In Prisoner of Azkaban, there are a few things that happen, namely around their first divination class. Many of Ron's statements and seemingly ill-informed predictions turn out to be true. He speculates about Harry's run-in with the Ministry of Magic, that Harry will come into a bunch of gold in the future, where he later wins the Triwizard Tournament and 1,000 galleons in the following book, and also, correctly, wonders whether Grim, seen in Harry's fortune, has anything to do with Padfoot. One more prediction that teases the next chapter in Prisoner of Azkaban, Ron comments that he sees the head of a hippo in Harry's tea leaves, seeming to cut himself off before finishing the sentence. In reality, it's possible that he was about to say the word hippogriff, and we see Buckbeak the hippogriff in the very next chapter. Lastly, Ron suggests in the final act of the series, in Book 7, to avoid saying Voldemort's name, which ends up being a wise move, as Voldemort has placed a new taboo on his name, allowing him to track down people that say it. I think there's a bit of confusion on this point. Some people suggest that there was a taboo on the name in the first Wizarding War, hence the He Who Must Not Be Named, but then it wore off after Voldemort lost the first go-around. Dumbledore asks McGonagall to say the proper name directly after Voldemort loses. Following this, Voldemort must have introduced a new taboo on his name later in the series, so there is probably a period of time between Book 1 and Book 7 where no taboo jinx exists, and then it's reintroduced while Voldemort tries to get to Harry. Let me know if you think that's wrong, but it's very unclear. Regardless, there is so much evidence for Ron having some type of seer ability that really isn't explored. I think the funnest example, that I didn't really get to, is that Ron's seer abilities are what allow him to be so good at chess. He just has a gut feeling about the best move. That said, it is possible that Rowling just used him as a foreshadowing element, but in the wizarding world, isn't that just called divination? Mrs. Norris, the Animagus. I can't believe that I never thought of this one. We all obviously remember Filch, the squib who functions as the caretaker of Hogwarts. Although, if we're being honest, I'm not really sure what useful things he could be doing when everything could be cleaned up much more easily with magic. First, a little refresher on squibs. In the words of Ron Weasley, quote, "A squib is someone who's born into a wizarding family but hasn't got any magic powers. Kind of the opposite of muggle-born wizards. But squibs are quite unusual," end quote. And not only are they unusual, they're typically otherized in wizarding society, to the point where they faced almost constant mistreatment, belittlement, and harassment. Filch being given a job at Hogwarts was likely an act of kindness from Dumbledore, but I don't know much about how he actually started working there, only that he didn't like the students much. One character that he did like, however, was Mrs. Norris, his cat companion that he was often seen patrolling with. And thinking back to the movies and the books, you might have found this relationship with the cat a little strange, maybe off-putting. But it's possible that you weren't really seeing the full picture. As this theory goes, Miss Norris is not the name of a cat, but rather a human-turned-cat, possibly stuck as one. Their relationship with Filch is not so much a pet and owner relationship, but instead, lovers. You see, Miss Norris was either transformed as some sort of punishment, or an animagus by nature. You guys made fun of me for mispronouncing that in my other video, so I looked it up, and half of you don't even know how to say it, so I'm not accepting criticism on the pronunciation of animagus. That's what it is. J.K. Rowling said it herself. Anyways, so Mrs. Norris and Filch find themselves romantically involved, and due to Filch's squib status, Miss Norris finds herself in a tricky situation. No one around her approves of her relationship with Filch, and may have gone as far as attacking her, transforming her into the cat that we see in the series. Alternatively, in a somewhat more wholesome theory, Mrs. Norris is actually an animagus and is careful to remain in cat form whenever walking around the castle, returning to her human form only in the confines of her shared room with Filch. Though she lives a life forever in hiding, at least there's maybe some times when she can revert to her human form in secrecy. I honestly don't really know what to make of this one. Filch ends up being such an inconsequential character. In the early books, he provides a sense of danger and consequence for sneaking out after curfew, but by the end of the series, Harry Potter and his crew have much bigger life and death type of issues than whether or not they're in their bunk beds after lights out. So, in the end, giving Filch a little bit more companionship than he appears to have at first blush might not be such a bad thing. Crookshank's original owners. Dear Padfoot, thank you for Harry's birthday present. It was his favorite by far. 1 year old and already zooming along on a toy broomstick, he looked so pleased with himself. I'm enclosing a picture so you can see. It only rises about 2 feet off the ground, but he nearly killed the cat and smashed a horrible vase Petunia sent me for Christmas. No complaints there. Wait a minute. That's a letter penned by Lily Potter to Padfoot, Sirius Black. Did you notice anything strange? According to Lily, the Potters had a cat, and in a fictional world like Harry Potter, there are no such thing as coincidence. So why then is it important that the Potters had a cat? Let's think of all of the other important cats in the series. There's obviously Miss Norris, who we just discussed, and the only other significant cat I can think of is Crookshanks, the unsung hero of Book 3, who helped the main trio into the Shrieking Shack, and of course, famously sniffed out Peter Pettigrew in the form of Scabbers. This is likely due to the fact that Crookshanks is half Kneazle, a type of cat-like creature with extremely high intelligence and an uncanny ability to detect unscrupulous individuals. So, back to the original claim. We know that Hermione, while originally looking for an owl, eventually settles on purchasing Crookshanks as her animal companion at Hogwarts. And note that the store owner told her specifically that, quote, no one wanted him. What if that cat was, in fact, the very same one that the Potters used to own? What if Crookshanks was Harry's childhood cat? Let's look at a few counterpoints. You may be saying, how could that be Crookshanks? He would have been way too old to have been the Potter's cat before Harry was born and still be alive at the end of the series. To that, I would say, Kneazles can actually have a lifespan of 70 years, well within the time frame that would have allowed Crookshanks to have lived with the Potters, lived on his own for 10 years, and then be purchased and cared for by Hermione years later. Second, you may be saying that Harry would remember his own cat, right? You may be right, but you might also be severely overestimating the memory of a 1-year-old child. It's perfectly reasonable for Harry not to remember he even had a cat, let alone that it looked like Crookshanks. So what do you think? Could Crookshanks have been the Potter's original cat who found his way back to Harry in order to protect him as best he could, trying his absolute hardest to eat Peter Pettigrew? While you think about that, let's move down to level 2. Snape and Hedwig. Okay, this is a really fascinating theory that I personally think adds even more tragedy to the story, both for Harry and for Snape. During the Battle of the Seven Potters, the famous bit where all the Order of Phoenix members disguise themselves as versions of Harry to throw off the Death Eater ambush, we see the tragic end of a beloved character, one that had been with us and with Harry since the start of his journey. Hedwig. Now, the books and the movies handle this a little differently. Looking back at the two, I think this was one instance where I liked the way that the movie treated it better than the books. You see, in the books, Hedwig is tucked away in his cage while the dogfight rages on around him. He is unfortunately hit by a stray curse and killed, all while just sitting there, not able to defend himself. In the movies, however, we see Hedwig coming to Harry's defense, an act that he would only do for the real Harry. Seeing this and understanding the consequences, Snape has to respond. He knows that the Death Eaters would likely have a fair amount of intel on Harry, including the type of owl he has, and seeing an owl flying around to protect one of the 7 Potters would immediately give the game away. So, knowing what has to be done, Snape is the Death Eater that fires on Hedwig, killing him not out of malice, but for the same reason he sacrifices himself for Harry's sake throughout the rest of the series, to protect Harry from Voldemort and the Death Eaters. I do think that the way that the movies gave Hedwig the agency to go down swinging, or flapping, it gave him a much more noble death, rather than just being in the wrong place at the wrong time in his cage. But what are your thoughts? Do you have any other times that you liked the way the movies did something better than the books? Vampire Severus. This was one of the more popular theories out there at the time when J.K. Rowling was actively writing the series. Snape was meant to be a vampire, and J.K. Rowling eventually took that part of his character out, but with the first few books already written, was unable to take back some of the character traits that she had written early on. For example, let's look at the way Snape is described. as a thin man with sallow skin, greasy black hair, a hooked nose, and black eyes. Not exactly how I would describe a normal human, though it might be how I would describe a vampire. You can also see this in the way that he's illustrated, both by the official illustrator Mary Grand Prix and by J.K. Rowling's own sketches. And then, of course, we can look at the way Snape is portrayed by the late Alan Rickman in the movies. He also gives off very clear vampire vibes. But enough the character description. Let's look at some of the hard evidence. We'll start with the more comical piece. This part of the theory goes that Professor Lupin, the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor in Harry's third year, knew that Snape was a vampire and assigned homework poking fun at him. In particular, there is an excerpt in the book 3 where Harry mentions needing to go to the library to work on a vampire essay for Lupin. Neville asks to go work on it with him, and Harry remembers that he actually already wrote it. Poor Neville. So anyways, Snape interrupts the conversation and eventually assigns homework on werewolves while filling in as the temporary Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Quote, "You will each write an essay to be handed in to me on the ways you recognize and kill werewolves. I want 2 rolls of parchment on the subject, and I want them by Monday morning. It is time somebody took this class in hand." End quote. Then, while Snape is filling in for Lupin, Dean Thomas jokes that the class might get a vampire as a teacher next. Potential foreshadowing of a scrapped plotline? Who knows? As a side note, I know this was a book for kids, but some of the names are so on the nose. For a bunch of students that speak all their spells in some form of Latin, you'd think they'd be able to see through their teacher named Professor Wolf. Anyways, lastly, let's jump ahead to the Half-Blood Prince. In it, we find the Sectum Sempra spell, one whose sole purpose is to lacerate the victim. Now, if I were a vampire, what kind of spell would I create? Perhaps one with the expressed purpose of making my subjects bleed. Even though I would presumably have fangs with which to bite my victim, it would be a fitting thing to also have magic that produces a similar effect. Unfortunately, I have to leave you with the knowledge that J.K. Rowling explicitly shot down this theory, though interestingly, she did originally plan to include a different vampire professor in the story, Professor Trokar, though she states in an essay on Pottermore that, quote, "While it is true that he has an unhealthy pallor and is sometimes described as looking like a large bat in his long black cloak, he never actually turns into a bat. We meet him outside the castle by daylight, and no corpses with puncture marks in their necks ever turn up at Hogwarts. In short, Snape is not a revamped Trokar." End quote. I'm still not sure. I have a feeling some of those character attributes still found their way to Snape, but what do you think? Luna is pretending. One of the sadder entries on this list deals with Luna Lovegood. Reading the title for this topic, you might be expecting me to say that Luna is pretending about all her beliefs, that the character she puts forward is just a facade, and that she's purposely trying to act weird. And you'd be half right. Unfortunately, the part you're missing is the sad part. Luna's mother, Pandora Lovegood, died in what Luna described as an experiment gone bad. In fact, she describes it as quite horrible. We don't ever get to find out exactly what she was experimenting with, but in the world of magic, I can imagine a spell going wrong enough to kill you would be quite terrible. Anyways, we are also told that Luna and her mother look very similar. So similar, in fact, that this is where the theory kicks off. With the death of his wife fresh in his memory, Luna's father Zeno is distraught, unable to focus, unable to give attention to his daughter, unable to do much of anything besides grieve. It gets so bad, in fact, that he is neglecting his daughter and unable to ever overcome his grief. We see this played out on screen, a man who has truly never recovered or been able to resume his life. Later in her youth, Luna looks so much like her mother that Zeno is constantly reminded of his lost wife and cannot mentally or emotionally deal with it. He was, however, still the editor at The Quibbler, where he wrote about strange aspects of the wizarding world, strange even by wizard standards. So, in order to connect with her father, Luna begins taking an interest in these strange topics. knowing full well that none of them existed, but choosing to feign interest around her father, as it's shown to be the only thing that's capable of taking his mind off his late wife. Whether Luna believes the stories by the time we meet her in the books is maybe a separate question. It's possible that she's still faking it, keeping up appearances so as never to damage the relationship she has repaired with her father, but it's also possible that she's been engaging with and researching these topics for so long that she herself has begun to believe them. To me, somehow that option is a little less tragic. At least she isn't forcing herself to engage with her father, but instead has found a mutual interest that they can enjoy together. Mysterious electricity. An aspect of the wizarding world that I find fascinating is their inability to comprehend the Muggle world. I'm probably reading too much into it, but there are weird distinctions between which parts of modern society they are able to and unable to understand. I continued to dig into this a little further, and I would guess that it has to do something with a series of isolating moves that the Ministry of Magic has forced on the Wizarding Society. J.K. Rowling writes in another post on Pottermore that when television was first invented, some wizards went as far as to create a British wizarding broadcasting company, but that it was quickly shut down by the Ministry. They defended this position and perceived hypocrisy on their allowance of wizard-operated radios by arguing that Muggles that overhear snippets of wizard radio are likely to believe they misheard something, rather than hallucinating something should they stumble across a wizard TV channel. My wager on this is that because the wizarding world, and specifically the Ministry of Magic, has been slowly isolating itself from the Muggle world, people are obviously still aware of Muggle technology, but they're just a little dumb. So, while characters will repeatedly point out that magic interferes with Muggle technology, I would posit instead that they just don't know how technology works. That maybe their magic isn't interfering with the light bulbs, they just don't know how to plug it in. While that might not be super believable for light bulbs, as technology gets more advanced, the more it appears as magic. Think of how difficult it is to explain configuring Wi-Fi to your grandma. Now, imagine a group of people that don't even know computers exist. Further, how old is Hogwarts? Most sources pin its founding at 990 AD, well before the invention of electricity and electrical wiring. So of course lights don't work there, they don't even have plugs to use them with. Lastly, if magic did have an effect on Muggle technology, we should be able to see that every time someone uses it in a Muggle location. And if it doesn't make technology go haywire, then maybe they really just don't know how to plug anything in. One more theory I had while researching this was about the development of magic in the first place. It is a genetic trait that's passed down from generation to generation, and in the past, Muggles used to live side by side with magical witches and wizards. Muggles and wizards went their separate ways, the former focusing on technology, the latter on their magic. But it does make me wonder if somehow technology, specifically electricity, is somehow related to magic. Or maybe it's like a cousin of electricity. I couldn't find any theories on this, so let me know if you have any in the comments. Harry drained the Dursleys. There is a certain nostalgia that hits rather hard when I think back to the scene in the Philosopher's Stone. No post on Sundays, Vernon Dursley says, only to moments later find the house riddled with letters from Hogwarts. I remember reading and later watching this happen, and it's stuck deep in my core memory. I also remember waiting up in my bunk bed on my 10th birthday, wondering if Hagrid would bust down the door. No luck there, unfortunately. The Dursleys, Harry's caretakers, are really the first villains we're introduced to. We don't really know Voldemort as a character yet, but we do know that Vernon, Petunia, and Dudley are the absolute worst. In fact, McGonagall tells us as much right away, stating that the Dursleys are terrible people. She calls them the worst kind of Muggles. But I'm here to ask you, what if it wasn't their fault? Suspend your disbelief for a moment. I know that the Dursleys are awful, and in real world, they would probably be in jail. But let's take a moment to explore a different perspective. one of a group of muggles forced to live in the presence of Voldemort's Horcrux for years and years. We know that Horcruxes can affect those around them. Look no further than the diary in Chamber of Secrets. Its magical powers possess and force Ginny to open the Chamber of Secrets, so it's very clear that being in the presence of the Horcrux can have a very negative effect on people. So let's go back to the Dursleys. As we know, they are supposedly bad people to begin with. But what if they weren't as bad as they were originally portrayed? Maybe McGonagall says they're bad people, but maybe her opinion was just tainted by the events that led up to placing Harry in their care. After all, how long would they have even known the Dursleys? Sure, it was Lily's sister, but why would anyone else have contact with Lily's sister besides Lily? What was informing McGonagall about the quality of the Dursleys? Maybe, while the Dursleys might not have been the best people to begin with, Harry and his status as a Horcrux was actually making it worse. Harry lives with the Dursleys for approximately 9 years before even demonstrating any magic at all, just living under their stairs. On top of that, Dudley is a developing child at the same time. He's roughly the same age, and I'm sure that a young child is more susceptible to the influence of a Horcrux. So though Petunia and Vernon Dursley might be bad role models, maybe the real reason Dursley is such a bad kid is because of Harry. Flash forward to the later parts of the series. Presumably, Harry is spending less time around the Dursleys, so if his Horcrux was affecting them, we should see that effect lessening, right? And maybe there is a tiny, tiny hint to this in the way that we see Dudley's attitude change towards Harry. Dudley begins to treat Harry like a normal human. So while we probably won't see much of the Dursleys after the conclusion of the series, maybe they aren't past redemption. And maybe, now that the piece of Voldemort doesn't live in Harry anymore, there's a chance that they might not be terrible people. I said a chance. And with that, let's move down to level 3. Dream theory. This theory is pretty divisive, not because it's particularly inventive, it may be for the exact opposite reason. It's probably a bit lazy and could be said about almost any series. I'm including it because I think it does fit a little better with the life we see Harry living, but I don't think there's really that much to it. In a nutshell, the whole wizarding world is in Harry's head, and is a way for him to cope with the harsh reality that is the death of his parents and living with the downright abusive Dursleys. Magic, Hogwarts, Dumbledore, they all are entirely figments of Harry's imagination to escape reality. So let's explore what seems to be the only concrete piece of evidence presented for this theory. It comes in the final book, in the final act, and what is close to the final chapter of the book, when Harry sacrifices himself, allowing Voldemort to kill him, or at least attempt to. We see Harry show up in the white space, King's Cross, Purgatory, Limbo, whatever you might call it, where he encounters both the piece of Voldemort's soul and the spirit of Dumbledore. Harry asks Dumbledore, quote, "Tell me one last thing. Is this real, or has this been happening inside my head?" To which Dumbledore replies, "Of course it's happening inside your head, Harry, but why on earth should that mean that it is not real?" That's it. That's all the evidence people needed to suggest that everything, all 7 books, happened in Harry's head. I'm not going to spend any more time on this one because A, I think it's stupid. B, I think it minimizes the development of all the other characters in the series. And C, it's stupid. But what do I know? What do you think about this theory? Is it interesting or is it a completely stupid waste of time? Other animal languages. The earliest scene we see of Harry demonstrating any type of magical ability is his trip to the zoo. In it, he vanishes a window, causing Dudley to fall into a boa constrictor exhibit, and directly after that, we find Harry speaking to the snake in Parseltongue. There are a couple things to take away from this early magical scene. First of all, the snake does not seem to express any surprise that Harry is speaking to him, though Harry is obviously shocked. What are the implications here? It would seem to suggest that A, the snake has spoken to other humans before, and B, that it might not be all that uncommon. I guess also C, that Snake is incredibly confident that he's going to be able to get back from the zoo in London all the way to Brazil. I guess this was the unexpected connection between Harry Potter and snakes on a plane. But let's take a look at the first two ideas. The snake is not surprised, which would suggest that speaking to humans is not that uncommon. This brings up a couple ideas to me. If that snake was used to speaking to humans, who was it speaking to? I doubt there are that many parcel tongues in London, as we know it's a somewhat rare ability in the wizarding world, which leaves me with really only two options. One, Voldemort, which, that doesn't seem possible. But second, maybe Dumbledore took opportunities to check on Harry from afar, and maybe he visited the zoo while on those trips. I kind of doubt it, but maybe. On to the main theory, though. If snakes have parseltongue, other animals must also have their own languages. And if not, why are snakes unique? To be clear, I'm making a distinction between the languages of other sentient beings in the series. Mermaids have Mermish, goblins have gobbledygook, but again, those are sentient beings. I'm talking about other common animals. Overall, the canon is a little unclear about this. There are examples of animals communicating, though how much of this is verbal or in another tongue is not explained. Padfoot/Sirius, for example, somehow communicates with Crookshanks, but were they speaking a language of cats and dogs, or just barking in a general direction? Wormtail is apparently able to communicate with rats somehow. Voldemort says the rats told Wormtail where Voldemort was, and again, we're not really clear what level of communication is going on here. His words exactly, quote, "He sought me in the country where it had long been rumored I was hiding, helped, of course, by the rats he met along the way. Wormtail has a curious affinity with rats, do you not, Wormtail? His filthy little friends told him there was a place deep in the Albanian forests that they avoided, where small animals like themselves had met their deaths by a dark shadow that possessed them." End quote. There is shockingly little information on this topic out there, though there are a lot of people asking the question. The most obvious conclusion that most people come to is that Parseltongue was the only animal language that was of any importance in the series, so it was the only one that was shown. What do you think? Does every animal have its own language that could be learnable? Is it just exceedingly rare? Or is there something inherently special and symbolic about snakes? Ron equals Dumbledore. Yet again, we've got a fairly divisive theory on our hands. One that had some fans excited at the prospect of a huge twist, and others lamenting the idea that something would upend their understanding of the world and the character building that had been done. To set the stage, the theory seems to originate on a very old Harry Potter forum from 2004, if that gives you any sense of nostalgia. The intro to the theory itself revolves around the game of chess, and not just any game, but the one that we see played in the Philosopher's Stone. To quote from this theory, if the chess game in Philosopher's Stone is a metaphor for the series as a whole, and the pieces the characters play a metaphor for their roles in the series, how do we reconcile the fact that Ron Weasley plays not only the role of the knight, but also that of the king, the same role played by Albus Dumbledore in the larger war? Pretty simple, really. Albus Dumbledore is Ron Weasley. End quote. From there on, a few other talking points, each some level of compelling argument that Dumbledore is in fact Ron. I'll pull out some of the more interesting points, but you can search for the rest on your own. 1. J.K. Rowling recycles ideas. Essentially, when a magical concept is introduced in the series, it almost always comes back in a more important fashion. Examples given are Animagi, where our first encounter with McGonagall explains the concept, and we find it to be much more important later on with the Marauders, Rita Skeeter, etc. Another example, we're introduced to Polyjuice potions only to have them be a defining twist when Barty Crouch Jr. is found impersonating Mad-Eye Moody. The point is, in Prisoner of Azkaban, we're introduced to the Time Turner, and J.K. Rowling spends the novel and the climax building out what it's capable of, without ever reintroducing it. This must have meant that it was going to be brought back, and Ron was the best fit, going from the position of the knight and time-traveling back to perform his duties as the king. allowing Harry to checkmate Voldemort. The second part of the theory connects Ron and Dumbledore's sweet tooths. We have seen that Ron likes sweets. It's basically our introduction to his character on the train. We also know that Dumbledore uses the names of candy as the passwords to his office. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Ron suggests to Hermione that they bring Harry back some cockroach clusters from Honeydukes. Later in Goblet of Fire, Harry must guess the password to Dumbledore's study, and after moving through a whole list of options, finally discovers the answer to be cockroach clusters. On top of this, Dumbledore tells Harry at the end of Philosopher's Stone that he lost his taste for Bertie Bott's Every Flavor beans after eating a vomit-flavored bean in his youth. The only problem is that Bertie Bott was born in 1935, and Dumbledore is more than 150 years old at this point, in the 1990s, and meaning Dumbledore's youth would have been long before 1935, leaving the only possibility that Dumbledore's youth was actually Ron's youth. Honestly, this section is getting a little long, and if you lost me here, I don't blame you. So I'll leave it there. You can look up the original post and read the rest of it, or maybe I'll try to include some screenshots of the other topics when I edit it. Either way, there seemed to be a lot of potential evidence. However, many fans, myself included after reading it all, arrived at the viewpoint that it would cheapen the character of both Dumbledore and Ron, and would remove so much of the magical mystery surrounding the headmaster. I, for one, am glad that it didn't come to fruition, and Rowling herself pointed out that this was false in a tweet back in the 2010s. But let me know if you were a follower of this theory back in the day. Mark Evans. If you were reading the books as they came out, and actively participating in the fan theory forums and discussions, you might remember this one. I, for one, had never heard of it, but maybe I was just too young at the time. The theory originates in the 5th book, Order of the Phoenix. Harry mentions to Dudley and his gang that he knows he beat up Mark Evans 3 nights ago. Normally a pretty innocuous thing to say. The only problem is that Harry's mother, Lily Potter, had the maiden name Evans. As you might assume, this set the theory world on fire, especially once everyone found out that the name of the 6th book was the Half-Blood Prince. You can imagine all the theories and speculation that took place. If Mark Evans, who is described as a 10-year-old boy in the book, was going to turn 11 in the next year, that would mean he would be an incoming student in Book 6, just in time to fill his role as the Half-Blood Prince. Mark Evans would be Harry's only other wizarding family, and that must have meant something, right? Even J.K. Rowling had to confront the theories, essentially admitting that the name was a mistake. Evans, in her words, was such a common name that she didn't even think about it. Mark Evans was meant to fade into the background and be forgotten as soon as the scene ended. She underestimated, however, the ability or knack of Harry Potter fans to read into and decipher every single clue written into the novels. Quote, "Then why, I hear you cry, did I give him the surname Evans? Well, believe me, you can't regret it more than I do right now. Evans is a common name. I didn't give it much thought. I wasn't even trying to set up another red herring. I could just as easily have called him Smith or Jones or Black or Thomas or Brown, all of which would have gotten me in trouble as well." End quote. But we're going to have to go even deeper than Mark Evans to get to the bottom. That's right, down to level 4. Basilisk venom. I have to say, this is one of those theories that you read at first and think, oh, that must have truly been a plot hole in the story, something that was just overlooked and shouldn't be read into any further simply because it was a mistake. So flashback with me to the Chamber of Secrets. The climax of the novel revolves around Harry's battle with the basilisk, and eventually stabbing the diary with its fang, effectively destroying the Horcrux. But something else happened along the way. As Harry stabs the massive snake from inside its mouth, he catches a stray, getting bitten by the basilisk, and should have, by all accounts, been killed by the poison. Luckily, he's saved by the phoenix tears of Fawkes, but it does raise a fascinating question. We see that basilisk venom is capable of destroying the diary Horcrux, so why then doesn't it destroy the piece of Voldemort living within Harry? Now, after searching, there seems to be a rather straightforward solution to this one, which not sure if that leaves me more satisfied or less. Sometimes I just want these theories to say mysterious. But regardless, the accepted answer is that in order to destroy a Horcrux and the piece of soul contained within it, it must be damaged or destroyed beyond the capability of magical repair. Essentially, if the container can be fixed, the piece of soul remains intact. In this case, because Harry didn't die, which would have qualified as beyond magical repair, and was fixed by Fawkes, the container wasn't destroyed and the Horcrux lived on. What's interesting here is that because this was pre-revival of Voldemort in the Goblet of Fire, were Harry to have been killed by the basilisk, I don't think he would have come back to life. I think the general interpretation here would be that the basilisk would have been capable of permanently killing Harry, and not in the way that would have sent him to limbo, seeing as the reason he went into limbo in the Deathly Hallows had to do with the protection of his mother's sacrifice, his willingness to sacrifice himself, and the fact that Voldemort himself was casting the killing curse. I don't know. This all gets incredibly complicated and fraught with argument. If anything, I think there are parts of this that the canon purposely does not fully explain. J.K. Rowling probably benefits from us continuing to discuss it years, almost 2 decades in fact, after the series concluded. If you've got thoughts on this one though, let me know, because even deep in the Reddit threads, people don't seem to be clear on what or how protection magic works. We know that Dumbledore had to cast a charm on Harry after Lily's sacrifice, and Petunia had to accept him into her care, but past that, I'm not sure we have any concrete answers. Forgetful Neville. I'll be honest, this is probably the most messed up item on this list, and it branches off in a few different possibilities, but it all ties back to Neville Longbottom, his history, and trying to forget. So let's get the darkest timeline out of the way first. We are all aware that the Longbottoms were tortured by Bellatrix Lestrange. It's revealed to us quite early in the series, and remains a driving force behind Neville's development until the finale. What we don't know is where Neville was while this is happening. We can read a very brief snippet in the Order of the Phoenix where Neville hears a sound and mentions that it sounds like someone is being tortured, after saying which he turns white and drops some food on the floor. There are a couple of interpretations here. First, it could just be an allusion to his history and backstory and just a reference point for readers to acknowledge. But the alternative gets really dark. It suggests that Neville was not only there witnessing his parents be tortured, but was in fact tortured himself, and then through the use of the Obliviate charm would have had his memory wiped. He was forced to forget the incident while his parents would have had to watch, while also being subject to the whims of Bellatrix, and when the crime is finished, Neville is returned to his grandmother, while his parents wind up in a mental health facility for the rest of their lives. Perhaps the reason for Neville's response is that the memory charm was not entirely effective on him, in part because it was cast on him at such a young age, and the moments of clarity that he had are akin to some form of wizarding PTSD. The other possibility to explore here, which is ever so slightly less dark, has to do more with mental health counseling in the wizarding world. All the same events happened without Neville being present. However, he still had to deal with the reality of effectively losing his parents. In order to cope with that, he would have visited some form of counseling or would have otherwise received psychiatric help. The twist is that in the wizarding world, the standard operating procedure for mental trauma, especially in children, may have been the Obliviate charm, effectively removing the bad memory from the child's brain. There are all sorts of problems with this, but the obvious ones are that I'm not sure how effective the charm would be at removing such a targeted little detail of his memory, especially when he actively visits his parents with his grandmother. It seems to me that if there were anything that would confound the effectiveness of the Obliviate charm, it would be regularly and repeatedly seeing the very thing that was wiped from your memory. Snape bullies Neville. Let's stick with Neville for one more part of this iceberg. You'll remember that early on, Snape takes a particular disliking for several members of Harry's incoming class. His dislike for Harry is, as we find out, some kind of feint, though I'm sure he is still pretty annoyed and probably genuinely hated him at certain points, or rather, maybe hated the fact that Lily's kid was so annoying. He also takes a disliking for Ron, which, obviously, but on top of our main gang, he also relentlessly bullies Neville. Now you might be thinking, so what? All the professors seemed to bully Neville in one way or another, and it was mostly just due to the fact that he was so incompetent early on. There's only so much grace you can give a wizard before you just end up frustrated. But what if Snape's annoyance and bullying of Neville went a level deeper? Think back to the prophecy that, at least in the books, is not entirely clear on who the Chosen One is. In fact, there were many theories revolving around whether Neville or Harry was the Chosen One, many of which aren't really reflected in the movies. Here's the prophecy from Sybil. Quote, "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. But he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies." End quote. So both Harry and Neville share a birthday at the end of July, and parents that are a threat to Voldemort. Aware of this prophecy, Voldemort attempts to take him out, in turn creating the child of prophecy, and his very own demise. But it didn't need to go that way. In fact, some argue that if Voldemort had gone instead to the Longbottom's house instead of the Potters, he would have created the Chosen One out of Neville. Obviously, there's some timeline inconsistencies there with the torture and everything, but you get the point. So let's bring this back full circle. Aware of this prophecy, Snape could potentially be aware of the fact that Neville could have been made the Chosen One, which implies that his parents would have been killed rather than Harry's. If that were indeed the case, it would mean that Lily would still be alive, and really, he wouldn't have any reason to watch over Neville. It's actually ironic that in choosing to go to the Potters instead of the Longbottoms, Voldemort created worse odds for his success. Creating Neville as the Chosen One might mean that he would have created a much more bumbling version of Harry Potter, without the innate skill, confidence, or Snape as a protector. So in a nutshell, Snape sees Neville as what could have been, a life staring at Lily while she continued to be happily married to James with baby Harry. Deathly Origins. If I look back at the original series, I think the objects that created the most confusion out of everything in the books was the introduction of the Deathly Hallows. By the end, it really feels like they weren't as important as they were made out to be. We ended up with a stone that didn't really raise the dead, a wand that wasn't all that different from the others, and a cloak that just made you invisible. That's a little reductive, but you get the point. The series is named after these things, and yet they don't really seem all that important in the end, save for getting across the theme of accepting death. So, useful for storytelling, but not as useful for actual characters in that story. But let's examine those Hallows a little more closely. Where did they come from, and how were they made? There is, of course, a rather boring, non-mystical answer that the Peverell brothers simply invented the Hallows. They used some sort of everyday name-brand magic. We're going to skip over that, because obviously that's boring. Instead, let's start with the Elder Wand. What's interesting here is that we know that the wand had a core made from thestral hair, so we can assume that the Peverell brothers were familiar with the animals and had comprehended death in a way that allowed them to see the creatures. How else would they get the hair from the thestral? What's interesting about this is that of all the powerful creatures that could have been used and could have been chosen to make the core of the Elder Wand, they chose an animal distinctly tied with understanding the concept of death. This obviously ties in with the overall Master of Death theme, as only someone who had accepted its inevitability could become the, quote, Master of Death. But still, it's interesting that the most powerful powerful wand in the world, it doesn't have a core made from dragon scale or something equally powerful. It's made with the hair from an invisible horse creature. So let's go one step further. There is a clear link between death and the Hallows. We've got the wand out of the way, so how about the cloak? Now, this is described as being completely unique, not at all like the other invisibility cloaks that you might find at a store. They'd still be expensive, but they wouldn't have quite the same capabilities as the cloak of invisibility. The canon describes it as Death's very own cloak. While I kind of doubt that the Peveril brothers actually met the incarnation of Death, I do think that there was something slightly more mystical at play. So what if the brothers were actually the first to discover the veil, and from it they were able to cut a small piece that became the cloak of invisibility? The way that characters describe looking through the veil and hearing voices seems very reminiscent of how other resurrected characters are described. That only leaves the stone, and this one is a bit of a stumper to me. It's described as a stone from a riverbed, but I can't think of anything in the series at all related to a riverbed and death. The most relevant thing I can think of is that the stone was actually chipped off the archway that the veil hangs on, and then was shaped into the stone that we see in the series. All that said, I'm not sure what ties all three of these together, or really what could tie the Thestrals to the veil, except for an understanding of death. Maybe Thestrals are creatures that came from another plane of existence? Maybe they were able to walk through the veil in the opposite direction. If you've got ideas, I'm all ears, because despite the research and the reading, the Hallows remain one of the most intriguing yet confusing parts of the series. But with that, we've made it to the end. Quite a wild ride with some of the most interesting theories I've ever heard. It really makes me think back to the days when all my friends would speed read the newest book and discuss theories in someone's basement. Those were the good old days. If you made it this far and like the content, click that subscribe button. It helps me grow the channel and keep making more content for you. If you're looking for other lore and fan theories, check out the other videos on this channel. There's another Harry Potter video, there are videos on Star Wars and Avatar The Last Airbender, even Pokemon. Let me know in the comments what your favorite topic was, and once again, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.